September 29th, 2004. On this cool autumn night, most residents of Westminster, California are sound asleep.
Westminster's a smaller bedroom community, about 11 square miles. It is about 5 to 10 miles from the beach. It can be busy. It can also be a quiet city.
But at 3:30 a.m., the typical quiet night is interrupted by a disturbing 911 call from 17-year-old Ryan Gerges.
Ryan Gerges called in a panic to say that he had been attacked.
Sir, what happened?
Two guys just jumped in my house, and then they tied me up and they put me in the closet.
Are they gone now?
I don't know, I'm running to the neighbor's house.
Ryan is frantic because his mother, 55-year-old Harriet Gerges, may be in danger.
My mom was inside the house, but they probably beat her up and took her or something. I don't know. I didn't want to stay around.
He doesn't know what to do, so he grabs his phone and he runs out of the house.
Aren't you concerned about your mother?
I am concerned about my mother. That's why I don't want to go in there and have nothing on me. They're like, don't make me have to kill you. Don't get your mom killed.
Ryan says, I was in fear for my life. I was in survival mode.
If it were me, I'd be very concerned about my mother. I want you to go back to your house.
I know, but I don't want to go back and have them there and they shoot me.
We'll be out there in a minute, okay?
Egyptian beauty Harriet Gerges was known for always putting others before herself.
She was like a really sweet person. She was like very tender-hearted. She was just very compassionate.
Harriet had big dreams of getting married and starting a family in the United States. And in 1980, her dreams became a reality.
Friends and family of Harriet in Egypt said that they found a nice young man that they wanted to set her up with, Magdi Gerges.
Magdi Gerges checked all the boxes Harriet was looking for.
He was handsome, he valued education, and he shared Harriet's dream of building a successful family here in the United States.
The two wasted no time tying the knot.
The marriage itself was arranged, and it occurred within 2 weeks.
After the wedding, the couple moved to Long Beach, California, where they were blessed with 2 sons, Richard and Ryan.
They built a life for themselves and did whatever they could to provide for their kids over the years.
My mom would work in like a sterile lab, like actually soldering like the chips and stuff.
However, Magdi was the primary breadwinner in the family. He worked as a respiratory therapist at Torrance Memorial Hospital.
Like many immigrants, Magdi had an incredibly strong work ethic and drive to succeed.
He just worked all the time, and he would just save, put away the money.
To save some money, he would chew gum for a little bit and put it in his refrigerator so he could chew it later.
And all of that hard work paid off, and he was able to save enough money to buy his family a home in Westminster.
We had a nice little spot over there, a little gated community. My mom would take care of the house. She would always cook for us.
Something smells great.
Oh, there you are, Richard.
Can I do anything to help you, Mom?
Oh, no, I've got it. Sit.
As their sons were becoming more independent, Harriet and Magdi were preparing to enter the next chapter of their lives.
Their oldest son, Richard, was in nursing school, while their youngest, Ryan, was a junior in high school, getting ready to fill out college applications.
Harriet and Magdi were now looking forward to finally being able to take more time for themselves.
But now, the Gerges family is struck with terror after a violent home invasion.
The only family members home at the time were Ryan and Harriet, so Richard and Magdi were spared.
After reluctantly returning home, Ryan calls his family while he waits for the authorities.
Richard, you gotta come home. Hurry!
I got a phone call from Ryan. He sounded very hysterical. I hopped in the car, took off.
It's then that first responders arrive at the home.
Ryan is clearly in distress. He has blood on his face, and he has duct tape wrapped around his neck and his wrist.
You gotta go upstairs and check on my mom, please.
After ensuring that Ryan isn't seriously injured, police officers head inside to check on his mother.
Officers enter the home with weapons drawn, but once inside, it's eerily quiet.
Upon entering the master bedroom, officers make a horrific discovery. Harriet Gerges is in a pool of blood. She's been stabbed to death.
After emigrating from Egypt to the United States, Harriet Gerges had achieved the quintessential American dream with her husband, Magdi.
The couple had 2 sons and built a home for their family in Westminster, California.
But now, police have just found Harriet brutally stabbed to death in their Southern California home.
Harriet wasn't just stabbed to death. She was nearly decapitated.
We're gonna need homicide down here. We'll secure the scene.
Authorities' next objective is to tend to the 911 caller, Harriet's son, 17-year-old Ryan Gerges.
Ryan had several pieces of evidence still on him, including duct tape, so he needed to be processed by our forensics. First, his hands were bagged.
Hey, what's going on? Where's Mom?
As soon as I got home, I could see my little brother, and he had like bags on his hands. And I was like, what's going on? Where's my mom? Where's my mom? They didn't want to answer.
At this point, police don't know who's all involved in the crime.
Please, come with me.
And then they ended up taking me and Ryan to the police station.
Moments later, homicide detectives and CSI arrive on scene to investigate.
When they go into the master bedroom, there's blood everywhere. And the bed next to where Harriet's body is found is filled with stab marks, as though the assailant stabbed her over and over and over again in a vicious rage.
She had been slaughtered.
Faced with the brutality of the crime scene, investigators now wonder, was this a botched robbery or something far more sinister?
Looking through the rest of the house, it doesn't appear that anything has been stolen.
There was nothing taken. There was nothing of value taken, and there was money, and there were other things like jewelry found in the house in plain view.
On top of that, there's no signs of forced entry, and the family lives in a gated community that requires a code just to get in.
To be killed and stabbed in such a violent way sends a different message. Harriet was killed by someone who knew her.
Hoping to get some answers, detectives head back to the station to speak with the Gerges brothers.
They decide to put Ryan and Richard in separate interrogation rooms.
Investigators sit down with Ryan first.
He was the only percipient witness to this and the only person in the house.
Really, at this point, he's the only suspect.
Is my mom doing all right?
I think we're going to talk about that in a second, okay?
All right.
Detectives don't waste any time cutting right to the chase.
Did you have a chance to check on your mom before you ran the house? Nah, I didn't have a chance at all because I was thinking like survival mode.
He was just afraid of what he might find behind the closed bedroom door.
But now, Ryan is ready to clear his name and tell police everything.
It did make me feel uncomfortable by the questions that they were asking, but I was the only other person in the home during that time. I know that they needed to get the story straight, so I felt like I just needed to lay everything out on the table for them.
Ryan says it all began around 3:20 that morning.
I woke up to the door opening. I thought it was my mom or something. And then one of them put their hands over my mouth. And they're like, don't say anything. Don't say anything. Shut up, kid.
And then I also felt something like in my mouth, like gloves. So I bit down on the hand.
And then like I jumped up. And then like they both like pushed me. And then I fell over.
I got slammed on the floor. My hands were duct taped.
They also wrapped duct tape around his mouth so he couldn't speak.
I noticed that the person that had tied me was taking off his gloves to grab like some shoestrings.
Then they used his shoelaces to wrap around his wrist to reinforce the duct tape.
I was bound at this point, and then I was thrown in the closet.
That's when Harriet, awoken by the commotion, ran into the room.
Oh, please don't hurt my son. You can have anything you want.
When I was in the closet, I was still able to see a little bit.
My mom came and then the guy like put the tape over my mom's mouth and everything. And she was resisting, but my mom was like, "It's not." And then I took her somewhere.
He saw his mom being escorted off by the other suspect into her room.
After that, things went quiet.
When I was in the closet, my heart was beating real. I couldn't really hear like every little small thing.
But after a few excruciating moments in the closet, Ryan heard a familiar noise.
He heard footsteps that sound like they were walking away, and then a car engine starting outside.
I was like, it's either now or never, if I'm gonna get out. So I broke free, got the tape off me, and all that.
I told myself that I needed to just run to my cell phone right away and then just run out of the house and then call 911.
After Ryan's story, detectives no longer believe he had anything to do with his mom's death. It's obvious he was just another victim.
Although one of the assailants Ryan described wore a mask, he claims to have gotten a closer look at the second attacker's face.
It looked like he was one of those guys that just came out of the pen and stuff, and just wanted revenge on someone. Did you recognize him again? Yeah.
Ryan agreed to later sit down with a sketch artist to describe the man's face, so they could get a good visual of at least one of the men to start hunting for.
With their suspicions of Ryan dissipated, detectives finally tell him about his mother's demise.
I'm sorry to have to tell you that your mom did pass away. We're obviously going through the process of trying to do everything we can to make sure we find the people that are responsible for this.
I just couldn't believe it, and it was just really tough when I heard that.
In a separate interrogation room, they deliver the tragic news to Ryan's brother Richard as well.
Before we go on, please, I deserve that.
So we have a murder investigation.
Oh, no, she's not. No, she's not. I didn't hear that.
My whole world went in slow motion. I remember I was pretty distraught.
No! No, she's not! She's not!
Richard, take it easy.
For the two young men, it's difficult to wrap their heads around their mother's death.
My mom was a very sweet, loving person, and she went to church a lot, and she didn't have any enemies.
But when detectives ask if there's anyone who could possibly be behind this, Harriet's sons have just one person in mind.
The only person that she had a problem with was my dad.
Police in Westminster, California are speaking with Ryan and Richard Gerges regarding the murder of their loving mother, 55-year-old Harriet Gerges.
She was killed in a pretty brutal fashion.
Harriet had absolutely no enemies. She was beloved in her community. She had a very small circle.
The only person her sons believe might have a motive would be their own father, Magdi Gerges.
The only person that she had a problem with was my dad.
Me and Ryan were just he had something to do with it.
The wrinkle in this scenario is that Ryan has shared that it was two black men that were the perpetrators of this crime. But they're wondering if this may now be a murder for hire.
But why would their father want to pay someone to kill his own wife? According to Richard, his parents' relationship wasn't as rosy as it appeared.
Richard says his parents are in a heated divorce. He says that his father even moved out of the house recently, which is why he wasn't there during the attack.
I don't know. We had Like the whole situation with my dad, they had like the whole court case going.
That's when Richard tells detectives a story, and it all begins to make sense.
It was around their anniversary time, and he didn't do anything. And she told him, like, hey, you know, like, why don't you take me anywhere? Or like, you know, it's our anniversary, you know, we should be celebrating this. And she was really upset.
You're not listening to me. You never put in any effort anymore.
Oh, here we go again.
Why did I ever marry you? You're so selfish.
In response, Magdi did something that no one, including Harriet, could anticipate.
He got really upset and ended up punching her in the face.
Magdi had actually abused Harriet for years, but it had never been this bad.
I had walked in and I'd seen my mom. She had tears coming down, and I saw my brother. He was like, Dad hit her, Dad hit her.
Oh my God, Mom. This has gone too far.
I confronted him. He just told me to like stay out of it. So I ended up taking her to the hospital.
At the hospital, Harriet was diagnosed with a broken nose and a hairline fracture beneath her left eye.
Magdi had physically abused her for years, but this time would be the last time.
She told him that, you know, my dad punched her in the face, and then that got the cops involved.
By the time Harriet and her sons got home, Magdi was on his way out, in handcuffs.
We were all like pretty shocked because we came home and the police were there. When they like put handcuffs on him, I remember him looking at me and he was like, this is because of you.
You did this to me! You'll be sorry, all of you!
Police officers followed up with Harriet and helped her get a protection order against Magdi, which banned Magdi from coming anywhere near her or the family home.
She really like ripped at him, like, you know, like he was abusive to me this whole time. Everything she said was true. She wanted a divorce.
Magdi was obviously infuriated.
Now, he could potentially lose his licensing where he worked at the hospital, and he could be out of a lot of money.
If she prevailed in the divorce, he could lose half his property, including the home that he worked so hard to buy.
Now with Magdi arrested, the family lived in fear of what he would do when he made bail.
He got that like stone cold look in his eyes because we've never really crossed him that way. I was kind of in the bottom of my stomach like, oh shoot, this is like really not good. This guy's gonna retaliate.
Westminster police have just learned that murder victim Harriet Gerges had a very tumultuous relationship with her husband, Magdi.
Magdi had been abusive toward Harriet for years, but after a violent punch to the face, she subsequently pressed charges and filed for divorce.
My dad, he was like really upset. I was kind of in the bottom of my stomach like, oh shoot, this is like really not good. This guy's gonna retaliate.
Magdi made bail after just 5 days behind bars and got himself a new apartment.
My dad was living in Long Beach on a restraining order.
Now, 7 months later, it seems Magdi is the only person with a motive to want Harriet dead.
So they bring Magdi in and ask him if he knows anything about his wife's murder, and his demeanor is very nonchalant.
So is there any reason you could think of why someone would want to break into that house?
Yes, and your guess is better than mine.
He says he has no idea, he doesn't know anything, but detectives were very suspicious of Magdi.
So they decide to just directly confront him with their biggest question.
Did you pay anybody to break into your wife's house?
What kind of question is this, my friend?
It's a question I have to ask.
No, I would never do that.
Magdi denies it. But once it becomes clear that Magdi's not going to confess, investigators have no choice but to let him leave. However, he remains the primary focus of their investigation.
So as soon as Magdi leaves the station, investigators get to work looking for something to connect him to Harriet's murder.
Detectives are able to confirm Magdi's alibi that he was at his apartment in Long Beach during the time of the murder.
We looked to see if there was a large amount of money withdrawn, as well as phone records to see if Magdi had talked to anybody that was out of his normal day-to-day routine, and we were unable to locate anything.
They tried looking for the man in the sketch Ryan helped them draft, but they couldn't find any man who fit the description with a connection to Magdi.
Every direction that detectives looked, the DA looked, they could not find anything tying Magdi to the murder.
Police, they were very optimistic at first, but they were running into a lot of dead ends.
Years pass without any new leads, and Magdi even moves back into the family home.
Ryan and Richard had moved out of the house and they were living with grandparents at that time.
Regardless, Harriet's loved ones aren't giving up the fight for justice.
We'd be calling the police and they're like, nothing new. I kept trying to push to keep it open and to keep things going. The whole department was trying to work on it.
And finally, in 2012, a breakthrough in forensic technology allows for a glimmer of hope.
With the advancement of technology and DNA, there was a chance that DNA evidence could have been left behind.
Ryan mentioned that when one of the intruders was tying a shoestring around his hands, he removed his gloves.
It was very likely that his DNA was transferred to the shoelace.
The detective went ahead and was like, you know what, I'll rerun the DNA evidence and we'll see what we could find.
When they ran that DNA profile through the National DNA database called CODIS, it belonged to a known gang member and hitman named Anthony Bridget.
Anthony's record shows that he is a career criminal, and he does have gang ties to the Trey 57 Crips gang.
Anthony Bridget had killed in the past. He fit the profile if you were looking to hire a hitman to do this job.
We compared the photo of the sketch made on the night of the homicide with Ryan to that photo of Anthony Bridget, and it was striking how similar the photos were.
He was someone totally opposite from anyone that our family had any ties to or any connections to. It was just mind-blowing.
Anthony had been arrested in 2007 for a parole violation and was currently locked up in California State Prison.
But now that they found Anthony, they're still wondering, did Magdi actually hire him? Or did Anthony have his own motive for the break-in?
Desperate for answers, detectives take a trip down to the prison to meet Anthony Bridget in person.
They're hoping that once they present all of the evidence they have on Anthony, he'll flip on Magdi to save his own skin.
Several of our detectives went up to interview him. Unfortunately, he didn't say much information.
Anthony refuses to give them any intel on Magdi or his mysterious accomplice from the night of the murder.
He's not talking. You know how it is with gang members. Snitches get stitches, right?
With Anthony a dead end, investigators must find another way to get the truth. So they meet with the district attorney's office to come up with a plan.
We decided that it was time to think outside the box.
We came up with an idea. If we posed as a friend of Anthony Bridget, who we knew was involved in the killing, and asked Magdi for more money, then we would confirm that our suspicions were true, that this was a murder for hire.
At that point, only two things could happen. Magdi could call the police and complain he's being harassed by gang members, which is what an innocent man would do, or he could react by paying them off.
Investigators in Westminster, California, are convinced Magdi Gergis is responsible for hiring two men to kill his wife, Harriet. They just need to prove it.
We decided that it was time to think outside the box.
They recruited two police officers from Long Beach who were on gang details, who knew how the Crips dressed and how they talked and how they behaved.
We set up surveillance and made the decision to have them confront Magdi at his home
As Magdi returns home from a shopping trip on January 30th, 2013, the stage is set.
The undercover officer who's leading the investigation using the pseudonym D Money confronts Magdi.
Check her out, man. My uncle locked up in the pen right now. We approached him about killing a wife. What I'm saying, we don't care about what the thing is. We want to get paid for it.
Magdi is not sure how to respond, but he doesn't back away. So they said, listen, you need to just give us $5,000.
Magdi doesn't take the bait right away, so the undercover officers put their phone number on a piece of paper and tell him to call them the next day about the payment.
Give me a call, man. That's my number. Just give me a call tomorrow about $5,000. Pick me up tomorrow.
This was all recorded on video, taking the piece of paper with the phone number. And now we had to sit and wait.
The next morning, investigators are anxious to see what Magdi does with the phone number.
Now, if he's innocent, he should call the police right away and report what happened to him.
But the next day, he went into the city of Long Beach and stopped at a payphone.
It looks like he's talking to somebody right now. Put that on a phone.
When Magdi makes his call, it's to none other than D Money.
And we were able to not only watch Magdi make the phone call from the payphone, but listen in through the wire of the undercover officer.
Magdi manages to call, and then all the confirmation we were waiting for was spoken. He said, I already paid.
Problem is, my boy's locked down in the pen like I told you yesterday. So, we're just trying to get paid just to keep it hush. You know what I mean?
I told you got paid over the day.
This is the first time that Magdi has admitted to making any type of payment in connection with his wife's murder.
Now we knew we were right.
As the undercover officer plays along, Magdi shows his true colors.
We got paid everything, but they pushing up on my boy, man. 5,000 ain't that much, man. I
don't have it. That's the problem. 1,500 I have on me.
Magdi once again showed what was most important to him, which was money, and began trying to negotiate down the $5,000.
It was a great moment. Then, just as quickly as that moment came, we were back to the nail biting. Because the next thing he did was ask who the middleman was.
This was new information to us. We were unaware of a middleman.
For a moment, they wonder if everything is about to blow up in their faces.
Fortunately for us, our undercover officer was quick to think on his feet.
Everybody know who the middleman was. I ain't worried about that. The information that I got, player, I can go to police. But I'm not. I'm just trying to get my money so I can go.
Magdi doesn't push the question again.
Once we had the confirmation that this was a murder for hire and there was a middleman involved, the next step would be the exchange for what we considered to be hush money.
You gonna bring 1,500?
Okay. All right.
All right, I'll see you tomorrow.
1 o'clock.
1 o'clock.
Bye.
Now the last question, will he actually pay up?
The next day, an entire team of undercover officers meet at the location to wait for Magdi.
We weren't sure if he was getting cold feet to go to the meet or not.
Eventually, Magdi shows up and the undercover officers go over to meet him. And they chat for only a moment before things get real.
Magdi never got out of his vehicle, but he did do a money exchange.
And as Magdi hands over the $1,500 cash, Westminster's undercover officer has one last question to ask him.
He had asked Magdi what his wife did that was so bad to have her murdered.
But he didn't take the bait.
Then he tried to drive away.
Okay, he's driving off. Not sure what happened.
Let's see.
For nearly a decade, Magdi Gergis has been the prime suspect in the murder of his wife, Harriet. And now, California investigators have launched a sting operation in an attempt to finally take him down.
So Magdi shows up to meet who he believes are gang members, but are actually undercover cops, and he hands them $1,500.
Our undercover officer had asked Magdi what his wife did that was so bad to have her murdered. Magdi didn't bite. He tried to drive away.
Okay, he's driving off. Not sure what happened.
They didn't need his answer. They still had more than enough evidence against him to take him down.
Long Beach is taking the takedown. Long Beach is doing the takedown. Stand by.
When they made an arrest on my dad, I mean, it was like a bittersweet moment because it's like, you know, my father getting arrested, but at the same time, I felt like wow, like we finally are about to get some justice.
Back at the station, detectives put Magdi in an interrogation room, and he immediately plays the victim.
He becomes very agitated, crying.
My wife problem is not solved yet. And we consider the husband as a suspect.
You know why I know why you're suspect. If you paid somebody to do this, and we know you paid them.
Detectives here are pushing for a confession, or at least for Magdi to realize that he has incriminated himself.
I'm not high on anybody. We recorded it. No.
There's an old saying, even the dumbest fish won't get caught if he keeps his mouth shut. And this man did. He maintained that sort of silence throughout.
To try to squeeze a confession out of him, the Westminster police think outside the box once again. They bring in their secret weapon, Magdi's son, Ryan Gerges.
We believe that by utilizing Ryan as an interview tactic to confront his father, that maybe his father would break down and give us information.
Both boys had not been speaking to their father since the death of their mother. They had moved out of the house.
I was about psychoprivacy. Is that you? What's wrong with you? You forgot that? You don't even look the same. You don't look like the same person at all.
And that's actually the first time that I confronted my dad about everything. And I sat there and I drilled him. I told him, like, how can you do this to our family? And I can't believe it. And he just opened up with like a sob story.
How can you still live in the same house that a murder had taken place in? How can you... It's not easy, but I have no other choice. What are you talking about? You have different choices in your life. You had a choice not to hurt me and Richard. You had a choice not to hurt your wife.
Unfortunately, he just sat there and denied everything and said he had nothing to do with it.
I was loving you, caring for you, believe. No, you did not care for me. Okay, I can die now, and I know that my son doesn't want to see me. Thank you. It's okay, my son. You're gonna be my son forever, in my heart, okay? Can't do this no more. Thank you.
I did walk away because I felt like my blood was boiling, but I just felt like I just got something off of my chest that day.
Even without a confession, police have enough evidence to charge Magdi Gerges with capital murder. And finally, 10 years after Harriet Gerges' murder, Magdi's trial begins in the spring of 2014.
The prosecution team paints Magdi as somebody who was focused on accumulating financial wealth, was selfish, and was an abuser.
Harriet's domestic violence case against Magdi Gerges was one of the primary motives for why she was killed. He would lose his license if he was convicted of a felony at that time. So it was very important that that case go away. In addition to that, there was all of the divorce issues.
He was very frugal, and he knew that if they would have divorced, my dad would have probably had to pay alimony.
So prosecutors believed Magdi came up with a plan. He would eliminate his wife before she could ruin his reputation and take his precious money.
Prosecutors believe that Magdy went through some type of middleman to hire two men to kill his wife.
They're certain one of the men was Anthony Bridget, but the identities of the second killer and the middleman are still a mystery.
Magdy gave them the code to the community gates and gave them a spare key to unlock the door.
Then in September 29, 2004, two men entered the home and tied up the younger son, Ryan, so that he was out of the way.
With Ryan tied up in the closet, the assailants carried out their deadly mission.
They turned their attention to Ariette.
They believe the other suspect was the one who actually killed Ariette.
He stabbed her over and over again. This is the most horrific violence.
Ariette's life was stolen at the very moment she tried to reclaim it. And that is the real tragedy.
Yo, let's go. Come on.
After that, the killers fled and remained anonymous for years. It almost looked like Magdy would get away with it. But thanks to breakthroughs in DNA science, police were able to hone in on Anthony Bridget and, by extension, Magdy.
Then prosecutors revealed their most damning evidence: the footage of Magdy paying hush money to the undercover officers.
His evidence of guilt is all in his state of mind and that intent to kill and the actions he did to make sure that happened and to make sure that stayed quiet. But it's not as if you have someone with a smoking gun for the jury to say, well, this is the person who did it.
And on April 17, 2013, the decision is left for the jury to decide.
Ultimately, they found Magdy Gerges guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder.
Magdy was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
When it's Anthony's turn in court, he's found guilty of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and is sentenced to life without parole.
For Richard and Ryan Gerges, finally seeing their father behind bars is a relief after 10 long years of seeking justice. But unfortunately, it's not the end.
The person who actually slayed Ariette Gerges is still out there, and so is the so-called middleman.
It was a little sad when it wasn't everybody, but at the same time, I thank God that we ended up getting the justice that we got.
As long as they're still free, me and Richard are still working hard to get the story out to everyone that could definitely help with the capture. If you have any information, please come forward to the Westminster Police Department.
While Ariette's absence has been a painful burden for her sons to bear, her memory reminds them of how to move forward.
She helped really teach me how to love and be affectionate towards others and be compassionate towards others.
Me and Richard have never, ever, ever went a day without remembering everything that she's done for us. She always thought about her kids and her family number one, no matter what.
Abuse is never okay. If you or someone you love is in an abusive relationship, there is help available. Call the Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-SAFE.
There are some crime scenes that stay with investigators because of what they find. And then there are crime scenes that stay with them because of what they cannot stop imagining. On the afternoon of August 6, 2026, in the Oakley neighborhood of Cincinnati, Ohio, police entered an apartment on Madison Road expecting to confront a situation that had already been described to them as dangerous. They did not yet know that behind one closed door, inside an ordinary bedroom, they would find the body of a 7-year-old boy. His name was William Michael Evans Ellis. He was 7 years old. 7. An age when the world is supposed to be measured in small things. The length of a school day. The favorite color of a child. The excitement of a new toy. The argument over bedtime. The stories children tell when they have something important to say, even when nobody else thinks it is important. William should have been worrying about things that belong to childhood. Instead, according to investigators, the final days of his life were filled with violence, confinement, injuries, and fear. And the most disturbing question is not simply how William died. It is how long people around him knew that something was wrong. On July 12, less than 4 weeks before his body was discovered, William's grandparents, Mike and Tina Evans, saw him for what would become the last time. To them, he still looked like their grandson. He was alive. He was moving. He was talking. He was behaving like a child. They remembered a small bruise on his shoulder, something that might have appeared insignificant in the moment. They also had video of William happily talking and playing in a family hot tub. There was nothing in those images that could prepare them for what would later be uncovered. When people look back at photographs and videos after a tragedy, the images change. The people in the pictures do not change. The room does not change. The child's face does not change. But the person watching them knows something the people behind the camera did not know. They know what came next. For William's grandparents, that July footage would become more than a family memory. It would become a painful dividing line between two versions of the same child. Before and after. Investigators now allege that sometime after that last meeting, William's life inside the Madison Road apartment became increasingly dangerous. The accusations are horrifying. According to the case presented by investigators and prosecutors, William was not simply the victim of one sudden act of violence. Authorities allege that he suffered repeated injuries and was subjected to prolonged abuse before his death. There were bruises across his body. There were multiple injuries to his head. There was a broken bone. Investigators also reported signs that could indicate burns. And there were allegations involving restraint. William was found inside a closet in a bedroom. He had been bound with tape. The amount of tape was enough, investigators said, to prevent the 7-year-old from freeing himself. Think about the size of a 7-year-old child. Think about how small his hands would have been. Think about the strength required simply to pull against restraints. And then think about the fact that the person inside that closet was not a stranger who had wandered into the wrong place. According to the investigation, William had been living in that apartment. The people around him were people who were supposed to be part of his daily world. His mother, Caitlin Evans. Her partner, Kirby Rankin. And Nessa Keeney, another person living in the home and described as sharing responsibility for William's care. That is where this story becomes more difficult to understand. Because danger is easier to imagine when it comes from somewhere outside. A stranger. A dark street. An unlocked window. A person nobody knows. But what happens when the place that is supposed to be safest becomes the place where a child is most vulnerable? What happens when the people who should notice a child's fear are the same people investigators say may have known about the violence? And what happens when messages written days before a death appear to suggest that what happened was not entirely spontaneous? Those questions would become central to the investigation. Investigators say that communications recovered from the encrypted messaging application Signal became a critical part of the case. According to the indictment, conversations involving people in the household allegedly began as early as July 1st. Authorities allege that those communications concerned William, his restraint, his abuse, and ultimately his death. On July 4th, investigators say Kirby Rankin sent a voice message to Nessa Keeney that allegedly referred to a plan involving the kidnapping and killing of William. Those allegations have not been proven in court. The 3 defendants have pleaded not guilty. But if prosecutors ultimately prove that these communications meant what investigators believe they meant, they would transform the story. Because then William's death would not look like an isolated moment of uncontrolled violence. It would look like something that had been discussed. Something that had been considered. Something that may have been anticipated. And that possibility makes the final days of William's life even harder to comprehend. There is another date that sits heavily inside the timeline. August 5th. According to investigators, the three adults left the apartment that day to take a dog to a veterinarian. William was reportedly left behind. At some point around this period, investigators believe William died. The exact timeline became one of the first major questions for detectives and medical examiners. Because when police arrived the following afternoon, William was already dead. And his body had been hidden inside the closet. At approximately 1:30 p.m. on August 6, officers were called to the apartment. What they encountered inside would become one of the most disturbing discoveries in the case. The Hamilton County coroner, Dr. Lakshmi Sammarko, later described the scene in terms that reflected not only the brutality of the death but the emotional impact of seeing a child in those conditions. She reportedly stood still for a moment after the closet was opened. There are moments in an investigation when professional language seems too small. A report can describe a body. A medical examiner can document injuries. A detective can photograph a room and label evidence. But none of those things can fully explain what it means to open a closet and realize that the person inside is a 7-year-old child. A child who should have been somewhere else. At school. With family. Watching television. Playing with toys. Building something out of Lego. As investigators moved through the apartment, that contrast became impossible to ignore. There were toys. There were signs of an ordinary home. There was a room filled with Lego. And yet, somewhere inside that same home, William's life had ended. The forensic examination would later reveal that the violence had been severe. On August 11, authorities announced that William's official cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head. But that diagnosis represented only the final injury. It did not explain every bruise. It did not explain every fracture. It did not explain the other injuries investigators documented. And it did not answer the question that would haunt those trying to reconstruct his final days. How long had William been suffering? The coroner said there were so many bruises that they were effectively impossible to count individually. Some injuries appeared to have occurred at different times. That detail mattered. A single catastrophic blow could explain a death. It could not easily explain a body carrying evidence of repeated trauma. Investigators also described allegations that William had been exposed to other forms of abuse, including restraint and forced contact with water. A homicide detective later described the case as one of the worst child abuse cases he had encountered in his career. Again, these are allegations contained within an ongoing criminal case. The courtroom will ultimately determine what can be proven. But even before that process begins, the facts already established by the investigation force an unbearable question into the open. Was William afraid? And if he was, who did he believe he could turn to? The answer may never be fully known. Children do not always have the words to explain danger. Sometimes they become quieter. Sometimes they stop asking questions. Sometimes they hide injuries. Sometimes they continue playing because playing is what children do, even when something inside them is wrong. And sometimes the adults around them fail to understand what those small changes mean. William's grandparents remember a different child only weeks earlier. They remember him alive. They remember his voice. They remember him talking. They remember him playing. They remember a boy who still had a future. That is perhaps the most painful part of this case. William's story did not begin in a closet. It began long before August 6. He had a childhood before investigators knew his name. He had people who loved him. He had ordinary days that never appeared in police reports. He had interests, habits, expressions, jokes, fears, and little routines that belonged only to him. And yet, after his death, the public would mostly encounter William through the language of a criminal investigation. Victim. Evidence. Injury. Indictment. Suspect. Murder. Conspiracy. Those words are necessary. But they are not William. William was a 7-year-old boy. And before we enter the darkest hours of this case, that is the person we have to remember. Because true crime can sometimes become obsessed with the person who committed the crime. The photograph of the suspect. The courtroom appearance. The police interview. The charges. The sentence. But in William's story, the center of the narrative should remain the child who never had the chance to tell his own story. The investigation would eventually lead to 3 defendants. Caitlin Evans, William's mother. Kirby Rankin, her partner. And Nessa Keeney, who lived with them. All 3 would face 13 charges each, including aggravated murder, kidnapping, felonious assault, child endangerment, and conspiracy. All 3 would plead not guilty. And prosecutors would announce that they were not seeking the death penalty. But before the indictments, before the courtroom, before the evidence was laid out for a jury, there was one apartment on Madison Road. One child. One locked closet. And a family trying to understand how a little boy who had been laughing and playing only weeks earlier could be found dead inside his own home. The most disturbing cases are sometimes the ones that leave behind no obvious boundary between ordinary life and horror. There is no abandoned warehouse. No remote forest. No anonymous house at the edge of town. Instead, there is an apartment. A bedroom. A closet. Toys nearby. Lego on the floor. And a 7-year-old boy who should have been growing up there. On August 6, Cincinnati police opened a door and discovered the terrible ending. But the real story begins before that door was opened. It begins with William alive. It begins with the people who knew him. It begins with the weeks between July 12 and August 6. And it begins with a question that will follow every part of this investigation. What happened to William Evans Ellis after the last time his grandparents saw him smiling? To answer that question, we have to go back to Oakley. Back to Madison Road. Back to the ordinary world William knew. Before the closet. Before the tape. Before the autopsy. Before the accusations. Before the courtroom. We have to go back to the beginning, when William was still simply a 7-year-old boy living in Cincinnati, and nobody yet knew how violently his story would end. Oakley is the kind of Cincinnati neighborhood where ordinary life can make tragedy feel even more impossible. The streets are busy without being chaotic. Cars pass along Madison Road. Apartment buildings stand close to restaurants, shops, sidewalks, and the routines of people going somewhere, coming home, picking up food, walking a dog, or simply trying to get through another ordinary day. It is not the kind of place most people associate with a story about the violent death of a 7-year-old child. And that is precisely what makes the setting so important. Because William Evans Ellis did not disappear into some distant wilderness. He did not vanish from a deserted road. He was living in the middle of a community. People were moving around outside. Cars were passing. Neighbors were living their own lives. And inside one apartment on Madison Road, according to investigators, something terrible was happening to a child. To understand what happened to William, it is necessary to slow down before the violence begins and look at the world around him. Oakley sits within Cincinnati, a city where old architecture and modern development exist side by side. Streets can shift quickly from quiet residential areas to busy commercial corridors. People live close to one another, but proximity does not necessarily mean that people know what is happening behind each other's doors. An apartment can be surrounded by hundreds of people and still become a private world. The sounds of everyday life can travel through walls. A door opens. A television turns on. Someone walks across a floor. A dog barks. A car starts. Someone comes home from work. And then the building becomes quiet again. For a child living inside such a place, home is supposed to mean security. It is supposed to be the place where the outside world stops. For William, according to the allegations now contained in the criminal case, that basic promise of home may have been broken. The apartment on Madison Road was shared by several people. William lived there with his mother, Caitlin Evans, her partner Kirby Rankin, and Nessa Keeney. Authorities would eventually identify all three adults as defendants in the case. But before they became names in an indictment, they were the people who occupied William's daily environment. That distinction matters. A child does not experience the world through legal categories. He does not wake up thinking about who is a defendant and who is a witness. He knows who prepares food, who opens the door, who tells him when to go to bed, who comforts him, who gets angry, who is safe, who is frightening, who he can ask for help. Those relationships form the architecture of childhood. And when something goes wrong inside that architecture, a child may have nowhere else to go. William was 7 years old. 7 is an age of rapid change. Children at that age are beginning to understand the larger world while still depending heavily on adults to explain it. They are old enough to recognize when something feels unfair, but often too young to understand why an adult behaves unpredictably. They can remember conversations. They can recognize faces. They can understand threats. But they remain physically small and dependent. That imbalance between a child and the adults around him is central to any investigation involving alleged prolonged abuse. The child does not have equal power. The child cannot simply leave. The child may not have money. The child may not have transportation. The child may not know where to go. And even when a child knows something is wrong, fear can make speaking almost impossible. That is why the memories of William's grandparents matter so much. Mike and Tina Evans last saw him on July 12. In their recollection, William still looked like William. There was a bruise on his shoulder, but otherwise they remember a child who appeared energetic and happy. They had video of him talking and playing in a hot tub. It is a deceptively ordinary memory. There is nothing cinematic about a child playing in water. No warning appears on the screen. No ominous message announces what is coming. William simply exists in the frame. He talks. He plays. He is alive. And that ordinary footage becomes haunting only because of what happened afterward. The human mind has a strange relationship with hindsight. When something terrible happens, people begin searching backward. They replay conversations. They remember small details. They ask themselves whether a bruise looked different. Whether a child seemed quieter. Whether a particular expression meant fear. Whether someone should have asked another question. Whether a warning had been hiding in plain sight. For William's family, July 12th would eventually become one of those dates. A last known moment. A point on the calendar separating what they knew from what investigators would later uncover. According to the indictment, communications concerning William and alleged plans to harm him began at least by July 1st. That means the investigation would eventually place disturbing allegations inside the same period in which William was still appearing in family memories as an ordinary 7-year-old boy. The contrast is difficult to comprehend. On one side of the timeline, there is a child laughing and playing. On the other, prosecutors allege conversations about kidnapping, restraint, violence, and killing. And somewhere between those two realities, investigators believe the truth of what happened to William was taking shape. The signal messages became particularly important because encrypted communications can preserve a person's words even when the people involved later tell different stories. A message can remain. A timestamp can remain. A voice recording can remain. The people who wrote them may later explain them differently, deny their meaning, or challenge the interpretation. But the digital trail becomes another witness. According to investigators, one message allegedly sent on July 4 by Kirby Rankin to Nessa Keeney referred to a plan involving the kidnapping and killing of William. That allegation would later become one of the most disturbing pieces of the case. But at this stage in the story, the important thing is not to jump immediately to the conclusion. It is to understand what investigators were trying to reconstruct. Were the conversations fantasies? Threats? Plans? Were they serious? Were they misunderstood? Were they carried out exactly as described? Or did events develop in a different way? Those questions would become part of the legal battle. The indictment would tell prosecutors' version of events. The defendant's pleas of not guilty would make clear that the allegations remained allegations. And ultimately, the courtroom would have to separate what could be proven from what investigators believed. But the setting gives those questions their weight. Because William was not living in isolation. He was living among adults. He was part of a household. There were shared responsibilities. There were routines. There were doors that opened and closed every day. There were moments when someone must have seen him. Someone must have heard him. Someone must have noticed the condition of his body. And according to the coroner, those injuries were extensive. The later medical examination would identify multiple head injuries, a broken bone, numerous bruises, and signs that could indicate burns. The coroner described the number of bruises as too numerous to count. That description changes the way we imagine the weeks leading to August 6. This was not simply a story about one violent moment. Investigators believed William had suffered injuries over time. The medical evidence would become a map. Every bruise could represent a moment. Every fracture could represent an event. Every injury could potentially narrow the timeline. Together, they would force detectives to reconstruct a sequence that no surviving witness could simply narrate from beginning to end. And that is where the apartment itself became important. Crime scenes speak through objects. A piece of tape. A door. A piece of clothing. A digital device. A discarded item. A room that appears ordinary until investigators begin looking at it differently. The apartment contained children's belongings. There were toys. There was Lego. These details matter because they remind us of the life William was supposed to be living. A child surrounded by toys is not unusual. A child building something with Lego is not unusual. A bedroom closet is not unusual. What is unusual is finding a child dead inside that closet. The same objects that make a home feel normal can become deeply disturbing when placed next to evidence of violence. That contrast would stay with investigators. Dr. Lakshmi Sammarko, the Hamilton County coroner, later spoke about the emotional impact of what she encountered. She had seen death before. She had examined victims of violence. She understood what a medical examiner is expected to do when entering a crime scene. Observe. Document. Remain objective. But William was 7. There is something about the age of a victim that can cut through professional distance. A 7-year-old is still small enough to be carried easily. Still young enough to need help tying shoes. Still young enough to believe adults can fix almost anything. The apartment on Madison Road therefore became more than a location. It became the center of a mystery. What happened inside? When did the violence begin? Who knew? Who participated? Who tried to stop it? And why was William still there? Those questions became even more urgent when investigators learned that his death may have occurred at least a day before his body was discovered. On August 5th, according to investigators, the adults left the apartment to take a dog to a veterinarian. William was reportedly left behind. The next day, the police would find his body. The gap between those two moments would become critical. Time is one of the most powerful pieces of evidence in a homicide investigation. A body does not simply tell investigators that someone died. It can help tell them when. Temperature, condition, injuries, decomposition, the circumstances of the scene. Each detail can move the estimated time of death backward or forward. In William's case, investigators believed he could have been dead for at least approximately a day. That meant that the final hours of his life had already disappeared before police arrived. The apartment had continued to exist. The outside world had continued moving. People had driven along Madison Road. Businesses had opened. People had gone to work. Someone had walked a dog. And somewhere inside that ordinary rhythm, William was already gone. Then came August 6th. Caitlin Evans reportedly went barefoot to Mercy Health Rookwood. According to investigators, she told staff that Kirby Rankin was threatening to kidnap and kill William. That statement would become a crucial turning point. Because whatever had happened inside the apartment, someone had now brought the danger into the open. The information eventually led authorities back to the Madison Road apartment. And when police entered, the mystery changed forever. The investigation was no longer about a missing child or a vague threat. It was about a dead 7-year-old boy. A boy whose body had been concealed inside a closet. A boy whose injuries suggested prolonged violence. A boy whose final days would have to be reconstructed piece by piece. The apartment was no longer simply where William lived. It was now a crime scene. And every room had the potential to answer a question. The bedroom. The closet. The children's belongings. The tape. The digital communications. The medical evidence. The timeline. Everything would have to be placed in order. Because somewhere inside that apartment was the story of William's final hours. But there was another story waiting to be told. The story of William before investigators knew him only as a victim. The story his grandparents remembered. The child who could laugh. The child who could talk endlessly about whatever had captured his attention. The child who could play in water and make an ordinary summer day feel important. Before the photographs of a crime scene, there were photographs of a child. Before the indictment, there was a family. Before the word murder entered the story, there was William. And to understand what was taken from him, we have to know who he was when he was still alive. That is where the next part of this story begins. Before William Evans Ellis became the name printed across police reports and courtroom documents, he was simply a 7-year-old boy. That distinction is easy to lose in a case like this. As an investigation develops, a person can slowly disappear beneath the language used to describe what happened to them. Victim. Child. Evidence. Deceased. 7-year-old male. The words are accurate, but they are incomplete. They do not tell us what William looked like when he smiled. They do not tell us what made him laugh. They do not tell us what he talked about when he was excited. They do not tell us how his family experienced his presence before his death transformed every memory into something painful. And they certainly do not tell us what kind of future he might have had. William Michael Evans Ellis was 7 years old. At 7, a child is still standing somewhere between two worlds. One foot is firmly planted in childhood, where imagination can turn an ordinary room into an entire universe. The other is beginning to step toward a larger world, where children start to understand school, friendships, rules, responsibilities, and the complicated behavior of adults. But 7 is still young. Very young. A child that age depends on adults for almost everything. Food, shelter, transportation, medical care, protection, comfort, a place to sleep. And above all, the belief that when something frightening happens, there will be an adult who comes running. That expectation is one of the most basic forms of trust a child can have. William's family remembers a boy who was still very much alive only weeks before the tragedy. His grandparents, Mike and Tina Evans, last saw him on July 12, 2026. That date would later become painfully significant. At the time, however, there was no reason to believe it would be the last time they saw their grandson. There was no final goodbye that felt final. No dramatic farewell. No understanding that they were looking at William for the last time. They simply spent time with him. They saw a child who appeared to be doing what children do. He was talking. He was playing. He was interacting with his family. There was even video footage of William enjoying himself in a hot tub, telling stories, and behaving like a child enjoying a summer day. The footage matters because it gives us something that police reports cannot. Movement. Personality. Life. A video captures the tiny details that written records erase. The way a child moves his hands when he talks. The way his voice rises when he becomes excited. The way he looks toward someone he trusts. The way he laughs without thinking about whether anyone is recording him. Those details are usually meaningless when life is normal. Later, they can become priceless. For William's grandparents, those images would become a kind of time capsule. They preserved a version of their grandson before the terrible events that followed. And they also preserved something else. A reminder that William was not always a name connected to a homicide investigation. He had been happy. At least in those moments, he had been. His grandparents did notice one thing that concerned them. There was a small bruise on his shoulder. In retrospect, the bruise became impossible to ignore. But hindsight can be cruel. When people know that a tragedy has occurred, small details begin to glow with a significance they did not seem to have at the time. A bruise can be ordinary. Children fall. Children bump into furniture. Children play rough. Children run too fast and collide with something. A mark on a shoulder does not automatically announce abuse. And that is one of the hardest realities for families after a tragedy. They are forced to revisit moments using information they did not possess when those moments occurred. They ask questions that may never have clear answers. Should I have noticed more? Should I have asked? Should I have insisted? Could I have done something? Could I have changed what happened? Those questions can remain long after the police investigation ends. But there is another important reality. The people who loved William did not have access to the evidence investigators would later discover. They did not know what was happening behind closed doors. They did not know what conversations were allegedly taking place. They did not know what the investigation would later claim about the condition of his body. They saw William as a child. And William himself may not have understood what was happening to him in the way an adult would. That is something often forgotten when people talk about child abuse. Adults describe events using legal language. Kidnapping. Conspiracy. Assault. Aggravated murder. But a 7-year-old experiences those events through fear, confusion, pain, and dependence. Imagine being 7 years old and realizing that an adult is angry. Imagine being 7 and not knowing whether the anger will pass. Imagine being unable to leave a room. Imagine being restrained. Imagine calling for help and not knowing whether help will come. We cannot know exactly what William thought. There is no surviving testimony from him. No interview. No final statement. No explanation written in his own words. That silence is one of the most painful aspects of the case. William cannot tell us what happened. So investigators have had to speak for him through physical evidence, digital evidence, witness accounts, and the timeline reconstructed after his death. His body became evidence because he could no longer be a witness. His injuries became a record. His final location became a clue. The messages allegedly exchanged before his death became part of a story he never had the opportunity to tell himself. This is why the identity of the victim matters. Without it, a case can become a puzzle. With it, the puzzle becomes a human life. William was not born to become the center of a homicide investigation. He was supposed to grow older. He was supposed to have ordinary problems. School assignments. Friends. Birthday parties. Arguments. Favorite foods. Embarrassing moments. Small victories. Bad days that would eventually become funny memories. He might have discovered music. Sports. Art. Science. Cars. Animals. Computers. He might have changed his mind about what he loved every 6 months. Children do that. They are constantly becoming someone new. At 7, a person's personality is still unfolding. Every year brings new interests and new confidence. A child who loves one thing today may forget about it tomorrow and become obsessed with something completely different. That possibility was taken away from William. His future stopped before it had really begun. The tragedy is not only that a 7-year-old died. It is that the world will never know who that 7-year-old would have become. His grandparents will remember the child he was. But they will never meet the teenager he might have become. They will never hear the adult voice that might eventually have replaced the child's voice in those family videos. They will never watch him graduate. They will never meet the people he might have loved. They will never see him become the person those early years were preparing him to be. That is the invisible dimension of homicide. A murder does not only erase the present. It erases every future moment connected to the victim. For William's family, that loss would be compounded by the circumstances of his death. According to investigators, his body was found inside a closet. That image is difficult to reconcile with the child described by his family. A closet is a place for things. Clothes. Boxes. Shoes. Toys. Objects people put away because they are not needed at that moment. But William was not an object. He was a child. And according to investigators, his body had been placed there after he died. The location itself became symbolic. A child who should have occupied space in the center of family life had instead been hidden away. The contrast between those two realities is devastating. There was a child who belonged in the sunlight. And there was a closet where investigators found the remains of his final hours. There was a room containing Lego. There was a child who should have been building things. There was a home that should have represented safety. And there was a crime scene. The coroner's description of William's injuries added another layer of horror. The autopsy found blunt force trauma to the head as the official cause of death. But investigators also documented numerous bruises, a broken bone, multiple head injuries, and signs that could indicate burns. The coroner described the bruising as so extensive that it was effectively impossible to count. That means William's final story cannot be reduced to one moment. There were multiple injuries. Some appeared to have occurred at different times. The medical evidence suggested a pattern rather than a single isolated event. And that distinction matters. Because a single act of violence may occur in seconds. A pattern requires time. It requires repeated opportunities. Repeated excess. Repeated moments when someone could have stopped. And that raises a question that reaches beyond the physical evidence. How did a child become so vulnerable inside the place where he was supposed to be protected? The answer may involve the psychology of dependency. Children often trust adults because they have to. They do not have the freedom to evaluate every adult relationship the way an independent adult can. If an adult tells a child that something is normal, the child may accept it. If an adult tells a child to remain silent, the child may be afraid to disobey. If the people responsible for protection become sources of fear, the child's world can become very small. That does not mean every child responds the same way. Some children fight. Some hide. Some cry. Some become quiet. Some behave as though nothing is happening. Some may even continue to smile and play. That last possibility can be particularly difficult for outsiders to understand. People sometimes assume that a child's suffering must constantly look frightened. Real life is rarely so simple. A child can laugh in the morning and be afraid at night. A child can play with a toy while carrying fear that nobody else can see. A child can love someone and fear them at the same time. A child can want protection from the same person they depend on for food, shelter, or affection. William's story cannot tell us exactly what he felt. But the evidence discovered after his death forces us to consider the possibility that his emotional world had become profoundly unsafe. And that possibility makes the July 12th family video even more painful. There is William. Alive. Talking. Playing. His grandparents watching him. A summer day continuing normally. No one watching that video could know that within weeks, investigators would be examining his body for signs of repeated trauma. No one could know that a closet would become the final location of his life. No one could know that police would eventually search the apartment for evidence. No one could know that 3 adults from the household would be arrested and charged. That is how tragedy often works. It does not announce itself. It moves quietly through ordinary days. It hides behind routines. It waits until afterward to reveal the meaning of things that once seemed insignificant. For William's family, the past would inevitably become a series of questions. What happened after July 12th? When did the bruises become more serious? When did the alleged abuse begin? Who saw William? Who heard him? Who knew? Who could have intervened? And perhaps the most painful question of all. What was William thinking during those final days? There is no answer we can give with certainty. Anything beyond the evidence would become speculation. And William deserves better than to have his final thoughts invented for him. What we can say is that investigators believe he experienced severe violence before his death. We can say that his body carried evidence of multiple injuries. We can say that authorities allege people close to him discussed plans involving him before his death. We can say that his body was found restrained inside a closet. And we can say that his death transformed an ordinary Cincinnati apartment into the center of a homicide investigation. But William himself remains larger than those facts. He was a grandson. He was a child. He was a person with a future. He was someone whose family still had memories of him laughing. And perhaps that is where his story should remain for a moment. Not inside the closet. Not inside the autopsy room. Not inside the courtroom. But in that earlier moment. A 7-year-old boy on a summer day. Talking. Playing. Alive. A boy whose grandparents had no reason to believe they were watching him for the last time. A boy whose life was still supposed to be moving forward. Then the calendar turned. July became August. The ordinary world continued. And somewhere inside the apartment on Madison Road, investigators believe William's life entered its final chapter. The next part of the story takes us into those final days. It takes us from the world William's family remembered into the events prosecutors say unfolded behind closed doors. And eventually, it takes us to the moment when the violence could no longer remain hidden. The last days of William Evans Ellis's life are difficult to reconstruct because there is no single surviving account that can tell us what happened from beginning to end. There is no final interview with William. There is no recording in which he explains what he was experiencing. There is no complete timeline that answers every question. Instead, investigators have had to assemble the final chapter of his life from fragments. Dates. Messages. Medical evidence. Witness statements. The condition of the apartment. And the statements made by the people who were there. When those fragments are placed beside one another, they create a picture that is deeply disturbing. According to prosecutors, William's suffering did not begin on the day he died. It may have started weeks earlier. The indictment alleges that communications concerning William began by July 1st. That date comes only days before his grandparents last saw him. At the time, however, the Evans family did not know that July would become the beginning of a timeline that ended with William's death. For them, the summer continued normally. For investigators looking backward, July 1st became something else. A possible beginning. The messages exchanged through Signal became important because they potentially provided something investigators rarely have in cases involving private violence, a record of what people allegedly discussed before the crime. Signal is designed to provide private communication. Messages can disappear. Conversations can be hidden from casual observation. But investigators were able to examine communications that they say revealed discussions involving William. According to the indictment, those conversations included allegations of kidnapping, restraint, assault, and ultimately killing the child. One alleged message was especially disturbing. On July 4th, investigators say Kirby Rankin sent a voice message to Nessa Keeney that referred to a plan involving the kidnapping and killing of William. If proven in court, that message could become a critical piece of evidence. But at this stage, the distinction between allegation and established fact remains essential. A criminal indictment is a statement of what prosecutors believe they can prove. It is not a conviction. The three defendants have pleaded not guilty. Their legal defense will have the opportunity to challenge the prosecution's interpretation of the messages, the evidence surrounding them, and the conclusions investigators drew from them. Still, the existence of the alleged communications changes the way investigators look at the physical evidence. A bruise that might otherwise appear isolated can become part of a pattern. A restraint can become part of a larger sequence. A date can become a possible turning point. The apartment itself can become a timeline. And William's body can become the final record of what investigators believe happened. Then there was July 12th. William's grandparents saw him. He was alive. They remember him talking and playing. They had video of him enjoying time in a hot tub. They noticed a bruise on his shoulder. At the time, the bruise did not reveal what was coming. That is important. Because after a tragedy, people often imagine that the warning signs must have been obvious. They rarely are. A bruise does not come with a label explaining how it happened. A child may fall. A child may bump into something. A child may get hurt while playing. Families do not automatically assume that every injury is evidence of a serious crime. And when the person involved is someone they love, they are often even more reluctant to imagine the worst. The July 12th memories therefore became painful only after the fact. The video showed William alive. The later investigation would show that he had died less than a month afterward. Between those 2 points was a period investigators now believe contained escalating violence. What happened inside the apartment during those weeks remains one of the central questions. According to investigators, William suffered multiple injuries. There were numerous bruises. There were injuries to his head. There was a broken bone. There were signs that could indicate burns. And investigators described allegations involving restraint and forced exposure to water. Each detail adds another layer to the final days. But the most important question remains the sequence. Which injury came first? Which came later? How often was William restrained? How long was he left that way? Who was present? Who caused the injuries? Who witnessed them? And what did each person do when William was in danger? These questions are not simply details for a courtroom. They determine the difference between an act committed by one person and a coordinated pattern involving several people. That distinction would eventually become central to the charges. The prosecution did not charge the 3 defendants only with murder. Each faced 13 counts, including aggravated murder, kidnapping, felonious assault, child endangerment, and conspiracy. The conspiracy charges are particularly significant because they reflect the prosecution's allegation that the violence involved planning or agreement rather than being entirely spontaneous. Again, that allegation must be proven. But the charge itself tells us how investigators interpreted the evidence they gathered. They believed William's death involved more than one isolated decision. And they believed the people accused were connected through actions and communications before the death. As the weeks passed, William's world became smaller. That is one of the most frightening possibilities in a case involving prolonged child abuse. A child can become trapped not only physically, but socially. If the people around him are the same people controlling where he goes, whom he sees, what he says, and whether he receives medical attention, his ability to escape becomes extremely limited. William was 7. He could not simply walk away from the apartment and create a new life. He depended on adults. He needed them. And according to the investigation, the people closest to him may have been the people who caused or permitted his suffering. The psychological consequences of such a situation are difficult to imagine. A child may not understand why an adult is behaving violently. He may believe he has done something wrong. He may fear punishment. He may fear that telling someone will make things worse. He may not know whom to trust. And when fear becomes part of everyday life, a child may stop expecting rescue. We cannot know whether William experienced these exact thoughts. There is no evidence that allows us to speak for him with certainty. But his injuries tell investigators that something happened. Something serious. Something repeated. Something that eventually ended his life. Then came August. The final week. The point where the investigation moves from allegations of prolonged abuse toward a specific death. According to investigators, William's death occurred around August 5 or earlier. The medical examiner later estimated that he could have been dead for at least approximately a day before his body was discovered on August 6. That estimate created a critical window. A window in which investigators had to determine what happened inside the apartment. The adults' movements became important. On August 5, according to investigators, the 3 adults left the apartment to take a dog to a veterinarian. William was reportedly left behind. That detail would become one of the most unsettling elements of the timeline. Because if William was already seriously injured, or if he was still alive and suffering, then the question becomes what condition he was in when the adults left. If he had already died, then the question becomes who knew. And if he was still alive, then the question becomes whether anyone recognized the urgency of his condition. These are questions investigators would have to answer through evidence. The apartment could not speak. William could not speak. So detectives had to reconstruct time through everything that remained. The physical evidence. The digital evidence. The statements. The movements of the people involved. The medical findings. Every minute mattered. And then came August 6th. The day the hidden truth became impossible to contain. According to the investigation, Caitlin Evans went barefoot to Mercy Health Rookwood. The image is difficult to forget. A woman arriving at a medical facility without shoes. A place designed for emergencies. Doctors. Nurses. Patients. People waiting for treatment. And somewhere inside that building, information about a 7-year-old boy was about to reach people who had never met him. Caitlin reportedly told staff that Kirby Rankin was threatening to kidnap and kill William. That statement became a crucial piece of the investigation. It gave authorities a direct warning. A name. A location. A reason to act. Police were eventually directed toward the Madison Road apartment. And when officers entered, they found William. He was dead. He was inside a closet in a bedroom. He had been restrained with tape. At that moment, the investigation changed from a warning about a possible future crime into an investigation of a child's death. The apartment became a crime scene. Every object suddenly mattered. The location of the body. The condition of the room. The restraints. The surrounding belongings. The digital devices. The relationship between the people living there. And the question that would immediately follow. Why was William inside the closet? A closet is normally a temporary place for objects. Clothing. Boxes. Things people do not want lying around. But investigators found a human being there. A 7-year-old child. And the evidence suggested that he had not simply died there by accident. He had suffered severe blunt force trauma to the head. The coroner would later identify that as the official cause of death. But William's body told a larger story. There were multiple injuries. Numerous bruises. A broken bone. Signs that could indicate burns. The number of bruises was described as too great to count. For the investigators looking at the body, the question was no longer simply, who killed William? It was also, what happened to him before the killing? That distinction would drive the next stage of the investigation. Because if William had been injured repeatedly over time, then the case required detectives to move backward. Past August 6th. Past August 5th. Past the veterinarian visit. Past the final 24 hours. Past the final week. Back toward July. Back toward the first alleged communications. Back toward the period when William was still appearing in family videos. The investigation was becoming a search through time. And every step backward produced another question. If William had been injured before his death, who saw those injuries? If he had been restrained, where did it happen? If the alleged messages described plans involving him, what did the participants intend? If the injuries occurred over several days or weeks, why did nobody intervene? And if one of the adults eventually went to a medical facility and reported threats against William, why did that happen only after he was already dead? That final question would become one of the most complicated aspects of the case. Caitlin Evans was not a distant stranger to William. She was his mother. She was one of the adults responsible for him. And yet, according to investigators, she was also the person whose statement helped police locate him. That contradiction would inevitably become part of the public discussion. Was she seeking help? Was she trying to protect herself? Did she know William was already dead? Did she know what had happened? Was she afraid of Rankin? Did she participate in the alleged abuse? Or was her role different from what investigators initially believed? Those questions could not be answered simply by looking at one moment. They required the full investigation. And the same would be true of Rankin and Keeney. Their roles would have to be separated. Their communications would have to be examined. Their movements would have to be reconstructed. Their statements would have to be compared with physical evidence. The prosecution would eventually accuse all three of serious crimes. But the investigation had to establish what each person allegedly did. That is the difference between suspicion and proof. It is also why the early stages of a homicide investigation can be so difficult. Detectives do not have the luxury of knowing the ending. They have to build it. Piece by piece. Statement by statement. Evidence by evidence. In William's case, the first pieces were already terrifying. A 7-year-old boy. A body inside a closet. Tape used as restraint. Severe head trauma. A broken bone. Bruises covering his body. Possible burn injuries. Alleged communications about violence. And a warning delivered to medical staff only after William was already beyond saving. But there was still one thing investigators did not have. A complete explanation. They had a crime scene. They had evidence. They had allegations. They had 3 people connected to the home. And they had a dead child whose story had to be reconstructed from everything he left behind. The next stage would be about turning those fragments into a case. The detectives would begin separating what was known from what was suspected. They would examine the digital trail. They would examine the household. They would examine the timeline. And slowly, the names of 3 people would move from the background of William's life to the center of the investigation. Because by August 6th, there was no longer any question that something terrible had happened to William. The question was who was responsible. And perhaps even more disturbing. How much had they planned before the first blow was ever struck? The apartment on Madison Road had already become a place of fear before police arrived. But on August 6, 2026, it became something else. A crime scene. The first officers entering the apartment did not know everything that investigators would later learn. They did not know the full timeline. They did not yet have the indictment. They did not know which messages would become important, which statements would change, or how many charges would eventually be filed. They had something much simpler. A report. A warning. A child in danger. And then, inside the apartment, they found the child was already dead. The discovery of William Evans Ellis marked the moment when the private world inside that apartment collided with the outside world. Until then, whatever had happened to William had remained largely behind closed doors. After August 6th, it could no longer remain there. The first critical lead had come from Mercy Health Rookwood. Caitlin Evans reportedly arrived at the medical facility barefoot and told staff that Kirby Rankin was threatening to kidnap and kill William. The statement immediately raised an alarm. There was a child. There was an alleged threat. There was a specific person named. And there was an address connected to the situation. For police, this was no longer an abstract family dispute. There was a potential victim who needed to be located. Officers were directed toward the apartment on Madison Road. The moments that followed would eventually become part of one of Cincinnati's most disturbing child homicide investigations. When police entered the apartment, they found William inside a bedroom closet. He was 7 years old. His body had been restrained with tape. The scene was horrifying enough that even experienced investigators were confronted with the emotional reality of what they were seeing. A child had been hidden inside a closet in a home where he was supposed to be protected. The closet was not some distant location. It was inside the apartment where William lived. That fact alone transformed the meaning of everything around it. A closet can be ignored during an ordinary day. A door can remain closed. Someone can walk past it without thinking. But investigators do not have that luxury at a homicide scene. Every closed door becomes a question. Every object becomes potentially significant. Every mark can become evidence. Every room can contain a fragment of the story. And in this apartment, the contrast between ordinary childhood and violence was particularly disturbing. There were toys. There was Lego. The kind of things that belong to a 7-year-old's world. Things a child might spread across the floor without caring about the mess. Things that can occupy a child's attention for hours. A piece placed on another piece. A structure built and destroyed. A new idea. A new game. The ordinary clutter of childhood. And yet, not far from those signs of normal life, investigators found William's body. The apartment had become a place where two completely different realities existed at the same time. One was the world people saw from the outside. An apartment. A family. A child. Daily routines. The other was the reality investigators were now beginning to uncover. Restraint. Injury. Fear. Death. The coroner, Dr. Lakshmi Sammarko, would later describe the scene and the condition of William in terms that reflected how deeply the discovery affected her. She was accustomed to difficult cases. She understood that death investigation requires discipline. A medical examiner must document what is present without allowing emotion to interfere with accuracy. But William was only 7. And the injuries were extensive. The closet became one of the first physical symbols of the case. William had not simply died. According to investigators, he had been restrained. The tape mattered because it suggested control. Someone had prevented a child from moving freely. Someone had made it difficult or impossible for him to escape. That raised immediate questions. Who had applied the tape? When? Where? Was William alive when it happened? How long had he been restrained? Was he conscious? Had he tried to escape? Had anyone hurt him? The crime scene could not answer all of those questions immediately. But it could provide pieces. The condition of the restraints. The location of the body. The position in which William was found. The surrounding environment. All of these details would eventually be compared with the medical findings. And the medical findings were devastating. William's official cause of death was later determined to be blunt force trauma to the head. That meant a significant impact had caused the fatal injury. But the autopsy revealed much more than one injury. There were multiple injuries to his head. There was a broken bone. There were extensive bruises. There were signs that could indicate burns. The coroner described the bruising as so extensive that it was essentially impossible to count every individual mark. For investigators, this immediately suggested that the final blow could not be viewed in isolation. William's body appeared to carry evidence of violence that had occurred over time. That distinction would become one of the most important aspects of the case. A murder investigation asks who caused the death. A child abuse investigation asks what happened before the death. In William's case, those two questions became inseparable. The medical examiner had to determine not only what killed him, but what the other injuries meant. Were they all caused during one event? Were they inflicted at different times? Did some injuries occur days earlier? Did some indicate a pattern of abuse? Were some injuries defensive? Were some caused by restraints? Were some unrelated? Each possibility had to be examined. The body had become a timeline. And investigators needed to read it carefully. The estimated time of death became another crucial piece. Authorities believed William could have been dead for at least approximately a day before he was discovered. That pushed investigators backward toward August 5th. On that day, according to the investigation, the adults had left the apartment to take a dog to a veterinarian. William was reportedly left behind. The timing immediately became significant. If William had already died before they left, investigators needed to determine who knew. If he was still alive, investigators needed to determine what condition he was in. And if the adults had been involved in the events leading to his death, their movements before and after the veterinarian visit could potentially reveal the sequence. The investigation therefore became a race against time, even though the critical time had already passed. Detectives began reconstructing movements. Who was where? When did they leave? When did they return? Who communicated with whom? What happened inside the apartment? What happened outside it? And what happened to William in between? The digital evidence became increasingly important. Investigators examined communications through Signal. According to the indictment, conversations involving William began as early as July 1st. The alleged discussions were not limited to arguments or vague threats. Prosecutors would later accuse the defendants of discussing kidnapping, restraint, assault, and killing. On July 4th, investigators said Kirby Rankin sent a voice message to Nessa Keeney that allegedly referred to a plan involving William's kidnapping and killing. If proven, that message could provide an important connection between the alleged planning and the physical evidence found in the apartment. But detectives still had to establish authenticity, context, meaning, and intent. A message can be disturbing without necessarily proving every element of a crime. Words must be connected to actions. Intent must be established. And the prosecution must eventually prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt. That is why the discovery of William's body was only the beginning. The scene told investigators that a child had died violently. The autopsy told them how. The digital evidence potentially told them what had been discussed beforehand. But investigators still needed to determine who did what. 3 adults were connected to the household. Caitlin Evans, Kirby Rankin, Nessa Keeney. Each relationship to William mattered. Caitlin was his mother. Rankin was her partner. Keeney lived with them and was described as sharing responsibility for William's care. The investigation could not simply assume that all 3 had played identical roles. Each person had to be examined individually. What did they know? What did they do? What did they say? What did they fail to do? And what evidence could place them at particular events? The fact that Caitlin Evans was the person who reportedly went to the medical facility added another layer of complexity. Her statement had helped bring police to the apartment. Without that warning, William might not have been discovered when he was. But the same woman was also William's mother. That contradiction would become unavoidable. If she believed her son was in danger, why was he still inside the apartment? If she knew of threats, when had she learned about them? If she had been afraid of Rankin, what had she experienced? And if investigators believed she had any role in William's death, how did her decision to seek help fit into that theory? These were not questions that could be answered simply by looking at the moment she arrived at the medical facility. Detectives would have to look backward. They would have to examine her actions before that day. The same would be true of Rankin. And of Keeney. The apartment was now full of questions. Every room had become part of the investigation. The bedroom where William was found. The closet where his body had been concealed. The areas where the adults lived. The objects belonging to William. The digital devices connected to the household. And the ordinary things that suddenly carried extraordinary importance. The Lego was one example. A toy can seem meaningless to investigators. But when the victim is a child, Those objects can become reminders of the life that should have continued. William should have been building something. Instead, investigators were building a timeline of his death. That contrast would remain one of the most painful aspects of the case. The forensic examination continued. The coroner documented the injuries. The cause of death was eventually established as blunt force trauma to the head. But the unanswered questions multiplied. Why were there so many bruises? Why was there a broken bone? What caused the possible burns? Why had William been restrained? Why had his body been placed inside the closet? And why had no emergency call been made earlier? These questions moved the investigation away from the simple idea of a single fatal assault. The evidence pointed towards something potentially more complicated. Something prolonged. Something involving multiple stages. Something that may have begun weeks before August 6th. The investigators were now looking at the entire month of July. The alleged signal conversations. William's last known contact with his grandparents. The bruise they remembered. The days leading toward August. And finally, the last 24 hours. The investigation was becoming a reconstruction of a child's final month. Every piece had to fit. If it did not, detectives had to find out why. That process can take investigators into places where assumptions become dangerous. A person may appear guilty because they were present. Another may appear innocent because they reported something. But neither appearance is enough. Evidence must establish the truth. And that is where the case would soon become much larger than the apartment on Madison Road. The digital trail was waiting. The alleged conversations were waiting. The medical findings were waiting. And 3 suspects were about to face questions that could determine the rest of their lives. For William, however, there would be no questioning. No opportunity to explain. No opportunity to defend himself. His story would have to be reconstructed by others. Piece by piece. Injury by injury. Message by message. Date by date. And the first people investigators needed to understand were the adults who had shared his home. Because the question was no longer simply where William had died. Police already knew that. The question was what had happened to him before that closet became the final place he was ever seen. And somewhere in the evidence gathered from the apartment, investigators believed they would find the answer. By the time investigators began separating the evidence from the Madison Road apartment, the case had already crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. William Evans Ellis was dead. The medical evidence suggested prolonged violence. The scene suggested restraint. The digital evidence raised allegations of planning. And the people connected to the apartment were no longer simply family members, partners, or housemates. They were potential suspects in the death of a 7-year-old child. 3 names quickly became central to the investigation. Caitlin Evans, Kirby Rankin, Nessa Keeney. Their relationships to William were different, but all 3 were connected to the home where he had lived and where his body was found. That fact alone did not establish guilt. Being present at a crime scene is not the same as committing a crime. Living in the same home does not automatically mean knowing what another person has done. And reporting a threat does not automatically explain what happened before the report was made. Investigators therefore had to look at each person separately. They had to reconstruct movements. They had to examine communications. They had to compare statements with physical evidence. And above all, they had to determine whether the evidence supported the increasingly serious allegations being made against them. The first name carried perhaps the greatest emotional weight. Caitlin Evans was William's mother. She was not a distant relative. She was one of the adults responsible for his care. That relationship made her role especially important to investigators. But it also made the case more complicated. Because Caitlin was reportedly the person who eventually went to Mercy Health Rookwood and told staff that Kirby Rankin was threatening to kidnap and kill William. That statement helped authorities locate the apartment. It was a decision that brought police to William. But by the time they arrived, William was already dead. Investigators therefore had to look at the events leading up to that moment. What did Caitlin know? When did she know it? What did she believe was happening to William? Was she frightened of Rankin? Did she attempt to protect her son? Did she participate in any of the alleged abuse? Did she witness violence? Did she fail to intervene? Or was her role misunderstood? Those questions would become central to the prosecution. The fact that she sought help could not erase everything that happened before. But neither could investigators simply ignore it. A criminal investigation is not supposed to follow a simple emotional narrative. It must follow evidence. And the evidence would have to establish Caitlin's specific actions. The second name was Kirby Rankin. Rankin was Caitlin's partner and lived in the apartment. According to investigators, his name appeared in the digital communications they were examining. The alleged July 4th voice message became especially significant. Investigators said Rankin sent a message to Nessa Keeney that referred to a plan involving the kidnapping and killing of William. That allegation placed Rankin at the center of one of the most disturbing elements of the case. But the message had to be understood in context. What exactly was said? What was being discussed before the recording? What followed afterward? Was the message authentic? What did Rankin intend? And most importantly, did the physical evidence demonstrate that the alleged plan became reality? These questions would matter in court. Prosecutors could point to a message. Defense attorneys could challenge its interpretation. Investigators could explain what they believed it meant. Ultimately, a jury would have to decide whether the evidence established criminal intent and participation beyond a reasonable doubt. Then there was Nessa Keeney. She lived in the same household and was described as one of the adults involved in William's care. Her alleged communications with Rankin placed her within the digital investigation. That meant detectives had to examine her role as well. Was she merely receiving information? Was she participating? Did she know what was happening to William? Did she agree with any alleged plan? Did she witness abuse? Did she attempt to stop it? Or did investigators misunderstand the meaning of her communications? Again, the answers would have to come from evidence. The danger in a case like this is that people naturally want a simple explanation. 3 adults. 1 child. 1 death. Someone must be responsible. But a homicide investigation cannot stop at that level. The law requires more. It requires specific acts. Specific evidence. Specific intent. Specific connections. That is why the investigation would take time. The first days after William's death were filled with questions. Detectives examined the apartment. They documented the body. They worked with the coroner. They looked at the physical injuries. They began reconstructing the timeline. And they examined electronic evidence. The medical evidence had already established something critical. William's death was not unexplained. He had suffered blunt force trauma to the head. But the other injuries suggested that the fatal blow was not the entire story. His body carried evidence of multiple injuries. The bruises were extensive. There was a broken bone. There were possible burn injuries. And investigators alleged that William had been restrained. These details forced detectives to consider whether the abuse had been happening over time. If so, the suspect list was not simply a question of who delivered the fatal injury. It became a question of who had access to William during the period when those injuries were occurring. The household became the center of that inquiry. The people living there had access. They knew William's routines. They knew when he was home. They knew when he was alone. And if prosecutors were correct about the alleged communications, some of them may have been discussing his fate before he died. The digital evidence therefore became one of the most important investigative tools. Messages can reveal relationships. They can reveal conflicts. They can reveal plans. They can also reveal things that people later wish they had never written. But digital evidence has its own limitations. A message can be misunderstood. A statement can be taken out of context. A joke can appear threatening when separated from the conversation around it. A threat can be real. A plan can be abandoned. An intention can change. That is why investigators had to connect the messages to what physically happened to William. The more closely they compared the two, the more troubling the picture became. According to the indictment, the communications did not merely discuss an abstract disagreement. They allegedly concerned William himself. His restraint. His abuse. And his death. That was enough for prosecutors to argue that the case involved conspiracy. Each defendant would eventually face 2 conspiracy charges. That meant prosecutors believed they could establish more than independent acts. They believed the evidence pointed toward coordination. Again, the defendants pleaded not guilty. The allegations remained unproven. But the charges indicated how seriously investigators interpreted the digital trail. As detectives continued their work, the question of timing became increasingly important. The coroner believed William could have been dead for at least approximately a day before he was discovered. That placed his death around August 5th or earlier. On August 5th, the adults reportedly left the apartment to take a dog to a veterinarian. This created a narrow and important window. Investigators had to establish who was present before the adults left. Who was present when they returned. What happened during the trip? What happened afterward? And whether William was alive or dead during those movements. The smallest details could matter. A phone location. A message timestamp. A vehicle movement. A door opening. A statement made by one person that contradicted another. In homicide investigations, time becomes a kind of invisible witness. It cannot speak, but it can expose contradictions. If someone claims they were somewhere at a certain hour, digital evidence may confirm or challenge that claim. If a message is sent at a particular time, it can place a person in a specific conversation. If medical evidence suggests death occurred earlier, an alibi can collapse. Investigators were therefore building a timeline not only of William's death, but of the movements and communications of everyone around him. The most troubling period may have begun weeks earlier. The indictment alleges that communications involving William began at least on July 1st. That meant the investigation could not simply focus on the last day. It had to examine the entire period between July 1st and August 6th. And that is where the July 12th meeting with William's grandparents became significant again. They had seen him alive. They had video. They remembered the bruise. If the alleged violence had already begun, then investigators needed to understand what the bruise represented. Was it related to the alleged abuse? Was it accidental? Was it part of a larger pattern? There was no simple answer. The medical evidence might help, but even forensic science has limits. An injury can sometimes be dated approximately, but not every bruise carries a precise timestamp. Investigators therefore had to combine the medical findings with everything else. Statements. Messages. Witness accounts. Physical evidence. The timeline. The more pieces they gathered, the more the investigation began to resemble a puzzle with missing sections. Some pieces fit immediately. Others did not. And some raised new questions. One of the most difficult was the behavior of the adults after William's death. If prosecutors were correct that the child had died before his body was discovered, then someone had to know where he was. Someone had placed him inside the closet. Someone had either known about or participated in the events leading to his death. And yet the outside world continued functioning. There was a veterinarian appointment. There were movements in and out of the apartment. There were communications. There was eventually a visit to a medical facility. That sequence was difficult to reconcile. Why was there no earlier emergency call? Why was William not taken to a hospital? Why was he not found by someone sooner? Why was his body concealed? And why did the warning about a possible threat emerge only after his death? Those questions would follow the investigation. The prosecution would eventually use the charges to present one theory. The defense would have the opportunity to present another. But at this stage, investigators were still gathering evidence. They were not writing the final story. They were testing possibilities. One theory might explain the digital evidence but fail to explain the medical findings. Another might explain the physical evidence but fail to explain the timeline. A statement might appear convincing until another piece of evidence contradicted it. This is the slow, difficult part of homicide investigation that rarely appears in dramatic retellings. There is no single moment when everything becomes clear. There are long hours of reading, comparing, rechecking, interviewing, waiting for laboratory results, going back through the same evidence again, looking for what was missed the first time. For William's family, every hour of that process had a different meaning. They were not trying to solve a puzzle. They were trying to understand how their grandson had died. They were trying to understand how a 7-year-old who had been alive and playing in July had ended up dead inside a closet in August. And they were trying to reconcile the child they remembered with the condition in which investigators found him. The investigation also began to attract public attention. The story was no longer confined to the apartment. News reports described the discovery. The charges began to emerge. The names of the 3 defendants became public. And Cincinnati learned that a 7-year-old boy had allegedly been subjected to severe violence inside a home where he should have been safe. But public outrage is not evidence. Anger does not establish guilt. And headlines cannot replace a trial. That distinction would become increasingly important as the case moved forward. The 3 defendants were eventually formally charged with 13 counts each. Aggravated murder, murder, kidnapping, felonious assault, child endangerment, conspiracy. The charges reflected the seriousness of the allegations. They also reflected the prosecution's belief that William's death was not an isolated event. There was an alleged pattern, an alleged plan, an alleged agreement, and an alleged final act of violence. But prosecutors still had to prove each element. And the defense had the right to challenge the entire theory. That meant the next phase of the case would depend heavily on the evidence investigators had gathered in those first days. The messages, the medical findings, the apartment, the timeline, and the statements of the people who had been closest to William. One of those statements had already brought police to the apartment. But investigators needed to know whether that statement was the beginning of the truth or only one piece of a much larger story. They also needed to know what happened inside the household during the weeks before August 6. Because the physical evidence suggested that William had suffered repeatedly. The digital evidence suggested planning. And the final discovery suggested concealment. 3 separate pieces of the puzzle were beginning to point in the same direction. But investigators still needed the connection. They needed something strong enough to transform suspicion into prosecution. Something that could survive a courtroom. Something that could withstand questions from defense attorneys. Something that could explain not only how William died, but why the prosecution believed 3 people should face the same 13-count indictment. That evidence was already emerging. And when investigators began connecting the digital communications with the physical evidence and the timeline, the case moved into its most consequential phase. The story was no longer simply about a child found dead. It was about what investigators believed had happened before his death. And the closer they looked, the harder it became to dismiss the possibility that William's final days had been planned rather than accidental. The next breakthrough would come from putting those pieces together. The messages. The injuries. The timeline. The household. And the words that investigators believed had been written before William's life ended. For detectives, the question was no longer whether something terrible had happened. That was already known. The question was whether the evidence could prove who had planned it, who had participated, and who had ultimately allowed a 7-year-old boy to die. The breakthrough in the William Evans Ellis investigation did not come from a single dramatic confession. It came from pieces. A message here. A medical finding there. A date that did not fit. A statement that raised another question. And slowly, investigators began to see that the death of a 7-year-old boy could not be understood by looking only at the final hours of his life. They had to look backward. The apartment on Madison Road had given them the first physical answers. William was dead. He had been found inside a closet. He had been restrained with tape. His body showed extensive injuries. But the scene could not tell investigators everything. It could not explain every bruise. It could not identify every person involved. And it could not reveal what the adults in the apartment had been discussing before William died. For that, investigators turned increasingly toward the digital evidence. The signal conversations became one of the most important parts of the case. According to the indictment, communications involving William began at least as early as July 1st. That date suddenly gave investigators a much larger window. They were no longer investigating only the events of August 5th and August 6th. They were examining a period of several weeks. And within that period, investigators say they found communications that appeared to describe increasingly serious intentions toward William. The alleged conversations concerned kidnapping, restraint, violence, and killing. One message stood out. On July 4th, investigators said Kirby Rankin sent a voice message to Nessa Keeney that allegedly referred to a plan involving the kidnapping and killing of William. For investigators, this was potentially more than disturbing language. If the message was authentic, if it was correctly interpreted, and if prosecutors could connect it to later actions, it could establish a link between alleged planning and the physical violence that eventually killed William. But investigators could not simply stop at the message. A prosecutor cannot walk into court and say, "This message sounds terrible." The evidence must establish what the message meant. Who sent it? Who received it? When it was sent? Whether the participants acted on it? And whether the actions described in the message corresponded with what actually happened to William. That meant the digital evidence had to be compared with the physical evidence. And that comparison was deeply troubling. The messages allegedly discussed William. The apartment contained William. The body showed evidence of violence. The closet contained evidence of restraint. And the medical examination showed injuries that appeared to extend beyond a single fatal incident. The pieces were beginning to overlap. The coroner's findings became particularly important. William's official cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head. But his body showed much more. multiple head injuries, a broken bone, extensive bruising, possible burn injuries, and other signs investigators interpreted as evidence of prolonged abuse. The number of bruises was so extensive that Dr. Lakshmi Sammarko described them as too numerous to count. That statement changed the scale of the investigation. The question was no longer simply who delivered the fatal blow. The question became what happened to William before that blow. How many times had he been hurt? How long had the abuse continued? Who was present? Who had access to him? Who had the opportunity to intervene? And if the injuries occurred over a period of time, why had William remained inside the same household? The medical evidence also supported investigators' belief that William had not died immediately before his body was found. He may have been dead for at least approximately a day. That pushed the timeline toward August 5th. And August 5th contained another important detail. According to investigators, the adults left the apartment to take a dog to a veterinarian. William was reportedly left behind. That movement became important because investigators could compare it with the estimated time of death. If William had already died before the adults left, investigators needed to determine who knew. If he was still alive, they needed to establish his condition. And if the fatal violence occurred before or around that period, investigators needed to identify who had been present. The timeline became a framework around which the other evidence could be placed. Digital messages could establish communication. Medical evidence could establish injuries. Travel and movement could establish opportunity. The crime scene could establish what happened to William's body. And witness statements could potentially explain what the physical evidence could not. One of the most important statements came from Caitlin Evans. On August 6, she reportedly went barefoot to Mercy Health Rookwood. She told staff that Kirby Rankin was threatening to kidnap and kill William. That statement helped authorities locate the apartment. It also introduced a complicated contradiction. Caitlin was William's mother. If she believed Rankin was threatening her son, why had William remained in the apartment? What did she know before going to the medical facility? Had she previously witnessed threats? Had she witnessed violence? Had she tried to protect William? Was she afraid? Or, as prosecutors later alleged, was she herself involved in the events that led to William's death? The investigators could not answer those questions through assumption. They needed evidence. The same problem existed with Rankin. His alleged signal message was disturbing, but investigators had to connect it to physical actions. And the same was true of Keeney. Her alleged communications could not simply be treated as proof of guilt. Each defendant's role had to be established separately. This is where the investigation became more sophisticated. Detectives were not simply collecting evidence. They were testing competing explanations. Could William's injuries have resulted from one event? The medical findings suggested otherwise. Could the restraint have occurred after death? Investigators had to determine what the physical evidence showed. Could the alleged messages have been unrelated to the actual killing? That required comparison with the timeline. Could one person have acted alone? The conspiracy allegations suggested prosecutors believed there was evidence of coordination. Every answer generated another question. And every question pushed investigators deeper into the evidence. The physical condition of William's body became one of the strongest anchors. A child cannot simply acquire numerous injuries without leaving a history. Some injuries heal. Others remain. Some occur at different times. Some reveal patterns. The investigators' task was to determine whether William's body contained evidence of repeated abuse. According to the coroner, it did. That conclusion made the July 12th memory especially significant. William's grandparents had seen him less than 4 weeks before his death. He had appeared well enough to talk, play, and enjoy time in the hot tub. There had been a bruise on his shoulder. The investigators had to determine whether that bruise was connected to the later pattern of injuries. It was not necessarily possible to answer that question with certainty. But the date provided an important reference point. William was alive. He was seen by family. And then, sometime between July 12 and August 6, his condition changed dramatically. The alleged signal conversations filled another portion of that gap. According to the indictment, discussions concerning William had already begun by July 1. That meant that investigators were looking at a disturbing possibility. The communications may have started before the last time William's grandparents saw him. If prosecutors eventually proved that those communications were genuine plans to harm him, the case would suggest that William's danger had existed while family members still believed he was relatively safe. That is one of the most painful aspects of the timeline. A child can be physically close to danger while the people who love him remain unaware of it. The distance between those two realities may be only a few walls. Sometimes only a door. The apartment on Madison Road represented exactly that kind of distance. Outside, Cincinnati continued moving. Inside, investigators now believed William had been suffering. The discovery of his body finally broke that separation. The outside world could see what had happened. The police could enter. The coroner could examine the body. Detectives could seize evidence. And prosecutors could begin constructing a case. The investigation eventually produced 13 charges against each of the 3 defendants. That was significant because it showed that prosecutors were not viewing the case as a single homicide charge. They believed the evidence supported a broader pattern. Aggravated murder. Murder. Kidnapping. Felonious assault. Child endangerment. Conspiracy. Each charge described a different part of the alleged conduct. Kidnapping reflected the allegation that William had been forcibly restrained or confined. Felonious assault reflected the allegation of severe physical violence. Child endangerment addressed the broader duty to protect a child. Conspiracy addressed the alleged agreement or coordination between people. And murder and aggravated murder addressed the death itself. The indictment therefore became a kind of legal reconstruction of William's final days. It told the prosecution's version of what happened. But the defendants pleaded not guilty. That fact remained critical. The investigation could produce evidence. The grand jury could issue charges. But only a court could ultimately determine guilt. At this stage, the breakthrough was not a conviction. It was the point at which investigators believed they had enough evidence to move forward. The case had become coherent. The digital evidence connected the suspects to alleged conversations about William. The medical evidence showed severe and repeated injuries. The crime scene showed restraint and concealment. The timeline placed the adults and William inside the same environment during the critical period. And the statement at Mercy Health Rookwood provided the warning that led police back to the apartment. Together, those elements created a much stronger picture than any single piece could have created alone. But perhaps the most disturbing part of the breakthrough was what it suggested about preparation. If the alleged signal communications were genuine plans, then William's death may not have been a sudden explosion of violence. It may have been preceded by discussions, decisions, agreements, and moments when someone could have stopped what was happening. That possibility changes the emotional center of the case. A spontaneous act can happen in seconds. Planning requires time. It creates opportunities. Someone can change their mind. Someone can leave. Someone can call the police. Someone can take a child to safety. Someone can say no. The allegation of conspiracy therefore raises a question far beyond the mechanics of murder. It asks whether there were opportunities to save William before his final injury. That question may never have a completely satisfying answer. Even a conviction cannot restore the moments that were lost. But the legal process can establish responsibility. It can determine what evidence proves. It can separate one person's actions from another's. And it can provide an official account of what happened. For William's family, however, the discovery of the alleged planning could have made the loss even harder to process. There is a difference between learning that someone you love died and learning that investigators believe his death may have been discussed beforehand. The first is devastating. The second introduces an entirely different kind of grief. It creates questions about trust, about proximity, about the people who were around him, about what William may have experienced while the adults around him knew more than he did. The investigation was now moving rapidly. The three suspects were no longer simply people investigators wanted to question. They were facing serious criminal charges. The evidence was being prepared for court. The prosecution was preparing to explain its theory. And the defense would eventually have the opportunity to challenge it. But there was one final development that would define the next stage. The case was no longer just an investigation. It was becoming a prosecution. On August 13th, the Hamilton County Grand Jury indicted all three defendants. Each faced 13 counts. The charges were severe. The allegations were severe. And the public reaction was immediate. But the legal process was only beginning. The following day, August 14th, all three defendants appeared in court and pleaded not guilty. The courtroom now became the next setting in William's story. The same case that had begun inside a family apartment would now move into a public legal process. The evidence gathered in private would be examined in public. The messages would be scrutinized. The timeline would be challenged. The medical findings would be interpreted. The roles of the three defendants would be debated. And William's final days would be reconstructed once again. This time, not only by detectives, not only by prosecutors, but by a justice system required to determine what could actually be proven. The prosecution had a theory. The defendants had their presumption of innocence. And William had no voice left. That is why the evidence would have to speak for him. The closet. The tape. The injuries. The messages. The dates. The statements. Every piece mattered. And as the case moved toward court, one question stood above all the others. Could prosecutors prove that the terrible events investigators had reconstructed were not merely a collection of suspicions, but a deliberate chain of actions that ended in the death of a 7-year-old boy? The answer would begin in the courtroom. But the courtroom would also reveal something else. There would be no simple ending. Because justice can determine responsibility. It can impose punishment. It can create a legal record. But it cannot undo August 6th. It cannot return William to his grandparents. It cannot erase the images from the family videos. It cannot rebuild the future that ended before it had a chance to begin. And it cannot make the closet disappear from the memory of the people who opened it. The breakthrough had given investigators a path. Now they had to prove where that path led.